Hello, friends and neighbors, and welcome to the poem of the day for today, Monday, September the 29th, 2025. Today is our last poem from Elizabeth Bishop's Geography 3. This is it. I believe I said at the beginning that there are 10 poems 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in this collection, and we've reached the final one. And I've read this collection before, but this time spending much more time, spending 10 days on it, and allowing that time in between to think about each of her poems, but also then having this occasion to talk to you all about them really made me appreciate the collection as a whole altogether in a much different way. Collections of poetry ask us to think about them as an entire concept, as an album, if you will. And there's, as I mentioned, a series of poems in here that can be excerpted and used for anthologies, taught separately. And I think you can get tremendous insight and tremendous joy and pleasure out of reading these poems on their own, for sure, because Bishop is such a talented poet. But to consider them all together and to think about why she placed them where she placed them and what she sees as some congruencies or continuations among each of them, variations on a theme, if you will, I think is something that's an interesting way to approach a poet's work. And so we've reached the finale here, and the finale is called Five Flights Up, and I will read it now. So this is Five Flights Up by Elizabeth Bishop. Still dark. The unknown bird sits on his usual branch. The little dog next door barks in his sleep, inquiringly, just once. Perhaps in his sleep, too, the bird inquires once or twice, quavering. Questions, if that's what they are, answered directly, simply, by day itself. Enormous morning, ponderous, meticulous, gray lights streaking each bare branch, each single twig along one side, making another tree of glassy veins. The bird still sits there. Now he seems to yawn. The little black dog runs in his yard. His owner's voice arises, stern. You ought to be ashamed. What has he done? He bounces cheerfully up and down. He rushes in circles in the fallen leaves. Obviously, he has no sense of shame. He and the bird know that everything is answered. All taken care of. No need to ask again. Yesterday brought to today so lightly. A yesterday I find almost impossible to lift. So, I struggled at the beginning of this poem to understand the relationship between the title and between what's being described. What's being described is this rather, as we know from Bishop, a rather ordinary and commonplace scene in one's life, which is, something you might see when looking out at your backyard or when going on a walk and seeing a neighbor's yard. And that's a bird alone on the branch, a dog lying outside asleep. If you have a dog, you are familiar with the way in which they sometimes make these short little barks or these little noises in their sleep. Most dogs do this, but my dog is very, very commonly will do sort of like a running thing when he falls asleep. Like his paws just kind of spasm back and forth as though he's chasing something, and sometimes he does just allow a little bark to escape there. And the dog and the bird are kind of united in their sleeping, and the poet interprets this as them asking questions. Doesn't say exactly what the questions are or what the nature of the questions are, but to the human speaker, they seem to be inquiries. And I think it's important because a big distance or a big separation that is central to this poem is that between human beings and nature. And this is something that's come up a couple times throughout Bishop's collection, namely in Crusoe in England, but also I think in The Moose. The Moose talks about this moment of possibility wherein a human can experience the sublime in nature, this gorgeous giant moose stopping the bus, but then we get that last line that they can smell it and then they just smell gasoline as they drive away, which reinforces, I think, the separation between the animal world and the human world. And that separation is all throughout this poem. You know, when the poet mentions, or excuse me, when the speaker mentions questions, we then get a M dash parenthetical that says, if that is what they are, which is an admission on the part of the speaker that they don't understand exactly. This is just kind of a guess. They're surmising this. And that the questions are answered directly and simply by the day itself, which to me means that the inquiries that animals have as opposed to the inquiries that humans have things that are more abstract, things that are begotten in the past or that are foreshadowed by the future, and animals seem to us to be always living in this kind of eternal present. And they also don't seem to have, as we learn a little bit later, any sense of shame. So the owner is yelling at this dog, and we're not really sure why. There's this, you ought to be ashamed. Now, it could be that the neighbor, the owner, finds that, the dog soiled inside. It could be that the dog, dug a hole. It could be that the dog was trying to chase a bird and disrupted the bird's sleep. The poet themselves doesn't even know. They say, what has he done? And the dog doesn't respond in shame, doesn't hang its head or tuck its tail. It bounces cheerfully up and down, rushing in circles in the fallen leaves. Shame is something that comes about through regret. It comes about by looking at the past and feeling as though something else should have been done, that a transgression was made. And in this poem, but I also think in real life, dogs don't really express a lot of that. They can pick up from you if you're upset about something and if they sort of should be in trouble about something, but on their own, they don't have reconsiderations of what they've done. And so that 2-line stanza, that couplet, that's the second to last stanza, he bounces cheerfully up and down, he rushes in circles in the fallen leaves, is this beautiful image of having joy, being in this spirit of joy in the absolute present. And the dog is at one with nature at this point in the way that the poet and the owner are not. And that recalls for me this wonderful section from the book Creaturely by the poet Devin Johnson, where he talks about walking his dog and all the sniffing that the dog does, and how that makes him realize that the dog is more at home in this world than I will ever be. And so at the end of the poem, we get, obviously he has no sense of shame. He and the bird know everything is answered. So again, we're relying upon an understanding of questions and questions that require answers, because that comes from a human perspective. But whatever the questions are that were for the bird and for the dog, even though they're different species not speaking the same language, they have what seems to be a common understanding, a common communication, or a common comfort being within this shameless world where everything is just the way that it needs to be, because they operate by instinct in ways that we don't. All taken care of, no need to ask again. Yesterday brought to today so lightly. Yesterday brought to today, for me, speaks to the constriction or the collision of past into present in a way that humans are less able to do in our common state. And that's where I think maybe the 5 flights up of the title comes into play here, because there's no actual ascension within the poem itself. There's no scene of somebody going up the stairs, for example, but there are 5 stanzas, and so there's an ascension from each of the stanzas, beginning with "Still Dark," which I think is the base, the ground, the inability to see, also the most terse line within the poem. And then by the end, we get to this image of joy and comfort within the everyday world. And we also get this moment where the poet then kind of intervenes. So there's an M dash right before yesterday brought to today so lightly, but then we get a parenthetical, which we've seen from Bishop several times before. A yesterday I find almost impossible to lift. And so to me, this says that nature has ascended to this fifth flight up to a state of being that's more transient, that's more elevated, but then the human cannot carry yesterday up the stairs with them. It's something that's too heavy, and so they're borne down. And it's because people, as I think I said earlier, don't live in the present in the same way that a lot of animals in nature seem to. We live constantly consumed by shame and regret of the past, and then anxious anticipation of what's to come in the future that causes us uncertainty. And so the yesterday becomes something that's impossible to lift for the speaker. It's an interesting way to end this collection, because it ends in a way that makes, I think, the clearest distinction between human beings and nature that we've seen throughout it. But I think it also calls back to the first poem in the collection, which I did not read here. I read, I think, on day 15, maybe, In the Waiting Room, which also has a trajectory of coming to a certain level of awareness. The trajectory in The Waiting Room is a kind of coming of age or coming to consciousness, and a coming to consciousness that comes about by hearing something that the young girl in the poem thinks is her aunt's voice, but she realizes is hers. And so there's a realization within there of this separate outside world that you think is there, but then understanding your place within it as an agent and a participant. And I think that is bookended, interestingly, at the end of this poem, where there's another reiteration of the separation between human and nature, but one that's less about coming of age, and one that's more about recognizing the kind of limited capacity that humans have. When I read this last poem, I don't think that it's a human superiority over nature poem. I think it's a, wouldn't it be nice to live in a world of barking questions and having no shame, and being able to speak to birds even though you don't speak their direct language, and running around and doing the circles in the leaves and having just bounds of joy. And in that way, I think it also participates in the location of being. That's something that's been important throughout this collection, but in a way that feels a little bit limited and a little bit regretful about the limitation that's in there. I think that's all I'm going to say today about that poem. We've completed this book. I think that tomorrow, for the sake of the timing of all of this, tomorrow's the last day of September. I think I might do one other Bishop poem, and then I'm eyeing doing some dark romanticism for October, because we're entering the quote unquote spooky season there. So that's my intention as we move forward. We'll see how I feel as I get closer to those, if that seems like an appropriate place to take the series. But thank you again for joining us. And if you enjoyed this poem but haven't heard the rest of Bishop's collection, I encourage you to go back to the rest of the videos, or just on your own to pick up Geography 3. It's a wonderful collection. A lot of people regard it as one of the most important collections of American poetry in the 20th century. And I hope throughout this series I did at least some small justice to the expansive beauty and thoughtfulness of Bishop's work. She was truly, I think, an incredible poet, and a great I was going to say aspect. Aspect is the only word I can come up with right now, but asset. There we go. A great asset to American letters. Yeah, and that's all. So have a wonderful day, and may peace be with you.